1986 was a big year for video games. This is the year that saw the first Metroid, the first Castlevania, and the original Legend of Zelda. These are some of the most celebrated video game franchises of all time. But for a lot of people, the most important game released in 1986 was the first entry in a series that would come to dominate the Japanese gaming landscape for decades to come, and set the gold standard for an entire new genre of games known in the Western world as the JRPG, or Japanese role-playing game. In this retrospective review, we'll take a thorough look at the original Dragon Quest, the mother of all JRPGs. What was so great about the game? Why did it have such a huge impact? And how does the experience hold up today? Dragon Quest wasn't the first Japanese RPG, and depending on how you keep score, it might not even have been the first console RPG made in Japan. But it's often regarded as the father of the JRPG genre, and with good reason. The exact meaning of the term JRPG is a matter of some debate, and you could easily argue it should be retired altogether. But even so, the term continues to see a lot of use. It is, after all, a convenient label. And even if people can't see eye to eye about what makes a JRPG or which exact games should qualify, any definition of the genre that doesn't include Dragon Quest would be pretty much absurd, because Dragon Quest embodies the JRPG standard. Pinning down the first Japanese-made RPG is a difficult task, and depends a lot on how you define RPG. Many people point to the Black Onyx as being the first commercially successful RPG developed in Japan, even though the game was developed by Henk Rogers, a Dutch national who didn't even speak Japanese, and despite the fact that the game is predated by other games with RPG elements like Dungeon, Underground Exploration, and Panorama Island. What we do know for certain is that by the time Dragon Quest was released in 1986, there was already a growing market for Japanese RPGs, with popular titles like Nihon Falcom's Xanadu, Namco's The Tower of Druaga, and TNE Soft's Hydlide. But even though Dragon Quest wasn't the first of its kind, its impact far exceeded anything that came before. It was the first Japanese RPG to reach a mainstream audience and become a pop culture phenomenon, and it set the standard for what people would come to expect from a console RPG, to the point where even today, the original Dragon Quest is the very definition of what we mean when we say traditional JRPG. Dragon Quest puts you in control of the descendant of Erdrick, a young hero who, the legends say, will restore peace to the troubled kingdom of Alafgard by defeating the evil Dragon Lord. Your adventure takes you across a large overworld or world map viewed from a top-down perspective, as well as towns, castles, and dungeons presented in the same format. Exploration takes you through plains, forests, hills, and poisonous swamps that drain the life from your limbs. Enemies are fought in random encounters, which can happen anytime you take a step in the overworld or in a dungeon, but are more likely to occur in forests, hills, and other harsh terrain. Careful navigation can save you a fight here and there, and later on you'll be able to skip the most trivial battles by using a spell. But if you plan to make any progress in the game, you'll want to fight as often as possible. And most of the game is spent wandering back and forth, looking for monsters to defeat, so you can grow strong enough to proceed to the next part of your quest. You only control the one character, and encounters are always against a single opponent. Battles are presented in a first-person perspective, as if seen through the eyes of the hero. Combat plays out in a turn-based fashion, and you select your commands from a menu before the start of each round, choosing to attack, cast spells, or use items. Or if things aren't going so well, run away. While this command-based interface remains fundamentally the same even in a modern turn-based JRPG, there is one key difference. And if you've never played a game this old, it might seem very strange. Instead of presenting combat feedback like damage numbers, critical hits, and status effects as graphical elements in the battle scene, Dragon Quest uses a message window below the action to write everything out in plain text. As the hero defeats monsters, he wins experience points and gold. Get enough experience points and the hero will gain a level, which makes him stronger. At certain predefined levels, the hero will also learn a new spell, including healing, attack magic, and other helpful enchantments, the use of which is limited by a pool of magic points. Towns provide a safe haven from monsters and a place to spend your gold. Gold is used to restore your hit points and magic points by sleeping at inns, as well as buy weapons, armor, and other helpful items from the game's shops. Beating the game means defeating the evil Dragon Lord, but before you can reach the final dungeon, you must first hunt down a number of key items hidden around the world. To know where to look for these items, you'll have to listen carefully to the game's many NPCs, who will tell you where to go and what to do, even if some of their clues can be a bit cryptic. Outside of these basics, there really isn't much to the Dragon Quest experience. There's only a handful of items to buy and use, there's really no character customization to speak of, and aside from choosing where to go, when to fight and when to flee, and what to prioritize when spending your gold, you don't get to make a whole lot of choices in this game. But in 1986, that was kind of the point. Dragon Quest was, by design, the simplest possible version of a console RPG. And a large part of the reason why the game became so successful has to do with how the game came to be. And more importantly, why. To understand how Dragon Quest came to be, you must first understand the history of the game development company called Enix, which, importantly to this story, was not so much a game developer as it was a publisher of games. Modern audiences might recognize Enix as the second part of the name Square Enix, a company that was formed by the merging of Square and Enix in 2003. But to gamers in the late 80s and 90s, the two companies were rivals for the console RPG market, with Enix being the industry leader all the way up until the late 90s when Square's smash hit Final Fantasy VII went on to conquer the gaming world. Enix began its existence in 1975 as the Eidansha Boshu Service Center, or the Public Housing Application Service Center, a real estate tabloid publisher founded by an entrepreneur named Yasuhiro Fukushima. In the glorious year of 1982, after some unsuccessful ventures into other industries, Fukushima decided to take a chance on the emerging video game market by restructuring one of his subsidiaries, Eidansha Systems, into a game publishing company. To symbolize the company's rebirth as an IT operation, he chose the name Enix, from a combination of the English word Phoenix and ENIAC, the world's first programmable electronic general-purpose digital computer. But for the owner of a software development company, Fukushima had a bit of a problem. He didn't have any software developers who could make his games, and he had no experience with the game development industry at all. Not to be deterred by such trivial matters, Fukushima hit upon a clever tactic. Inspired by the way the manga industry would search for new talent, Fukushima devised a series of competitions called the Enix Game Hobby Program Contest, where aspiring game developers could enter their homemade games for judging. The competition was advertised widely in both computer magazines and manga publications, and while many entrants were attracted by the prospect of a generous 1 million yen cash prize for the grand winner, the real purpose of these contests was for Enix to scout for talent. But Enix wasn't looking to hire on the winners as employees of the company. Instead, they struck upon a publisher-developer relationship with the winners, where Enix would handle the packaging, distribution, and promotion of the games, then pay the talent royalties for their hard work on the finished product. The Enix Game Hobby Program Contest ended up being a huge success, and many of the games entered into the contest went on to be published by Enix. The first batch of 13 winning titles from the initial contest were made available for home computers in February of 1983 and proved commercially successful. Two of those titles were Door Door, a puzzle game designed by Koichi Nakamura, and Love Match Tennis, a sports game created by Yuji Horii. Enix's inventive business model thus proved, the company started screaming for more titles to bring to market. Nakamura and Horii, both eager to continue their budding careers as video game developers, were quick to answer the call, eventually registering their own companies for the purpose of providing these services. Nakamura started Chunsoft, based on his nickname of Chun, while Horii created a company called Armor Project. Although Enix initially focused their efforts on Japanese home computers, such as the NEC PC-88 series, the massive success of the Famicom, known in the West as the Nintendo Entertainment System, which had brought about a revolution within the video game industry after its launch in 1983, convinced Enix to try their hand at publishing games for the console markets, and Nakamura and Hori ended up being instrumental in those efforts. When Enix published its first Famicom game in July of 1985, it was a port of Nakamura's Door Door. More importantly to this story, Enix's second Famicom title would be the start of a crucial collaboration, a console version of Hori's second game, the groundbreaking The Portopia Serial Murder Case, ported to the Famicom by Nakamura. In the process, Hori and Nakamura's working relationship developed into a friendship, largely based off of their common love of gaming. And as they started to bounce ideas around for their next project, they realized there was one particular type of games they were both truly passionate about. Something that had arrived from overseas in recent years and had become something of an addiction for both men: American computer role-playing games. The tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons was first published in the early 1970s, and this new type of creative experience, with its infinite possibilities, endless replayability, and unique blend of gaming and storytelling, proved to be incredibly popular, quickly capturing the imaginations of millions of people around the world. And of course, as soon as D&D nerds got their hands on their first computers, they started trying to translate something of this experience into the digital world. D&D clones are some of the earliest video game titles ever created, with many being hobby projects on university mainframes, most of which have now been lost to history. But around the turn of the decade and the start of the 1980s, two hugely influential commercial titles began to turn the tide, demonstrating the massive potential of the computer role-playing game: Ultima by Origin Systems and Certex's Wizardry. Although the role-playing experience these games provided was held back by the limitations of the hardware, the titles were impressive for their time, and inspired successive generations of game designers to elaborate on the RPG format in countless ways. Wizardry in particular gained immense popularity among hardcore Japanese gamers. The game was a straight-up dungeon crawler, but the depth of the gameplay was unparalleled for an early 80s title. With the possibility to create your own party of adventurers, the satisfaction of seeing those heroes grow stronger as you explored a dangerous environment, and the thrill of walking the razor's edge between the triumph of making it safely back to town with a big haul, or the agony of losing all that progress to a string of bad luck. Ultima, while not as complex or addictive as Wizardry, presented an entire world to explore outside of its dungeons, and perhaps more importantly, the game had a story. Hori and Nakamura wanted to share these gaming experiences with the masses. But for all their strengths, Wizardry and Ultima were also unintuitive, numbers-heavy, and relied heavily on the player's pre-existing familiarity with many of the fundamental concepts of Dungeons & Dragons. And even if you were the kind of person who would appreciate this kind of game, you still had to own a computer in order to play them, which at the time was not all that common. PC gaming in the 80s and early 90s was mostly the domain of the truly die-hard geek. While PC titles offered cutting-edge software and limitless potential, the overall user experience was often atrocious. In the dark ages before Steam and DirectX, getting a game to run on your machine was a flip of a coin, and even if you stuck with one of the more standardized platforms like the Commodore 64, simply loading a game was an exercise in black magic. Home computers were also expensive, limiting their spread to professionals and the most enthusiastic hobbyists. Dragon Slayer 2 Xanadu, a popular Japanese RPG, had been originally designed for the NEC PC-8801, which at the time of the game's release in 1985 would have set a prospective gamer back at least 100,000 yen depending on the model, in a time when the average monthly salary was about 260,000 yen. Meanwhile, Nintendo's family computer, better known as the Famicom, retailed for just under 15,000 yen, guaranteed compatibility with the software without the need for an installation, ran games instantly when you hit the power button, and offered a user experience so simple a 5-year-old child could figure it out. Better yet, it was already in millions of homes across Japan. Hori and Nakamura thought that if they could take what was so addictive about Wizardry and Ultima and replicate that experience for the Famicom, they might have a huge hit on their hands. The title of their new role-playing game would be Dragon Quest, and Hori would design the game while Nakamura, under the label of his company Chunsoft, would program it. But there were a couple of challenges they had to deal with. Compared to the most powerful home computers of the time, the Famicom presented more restrictions on hardware and memory. Its interface was limited to a simple gamepad with a handful of buttons, and perhaps most important of all, the target audience was much younger, and the vast majority of them knew nothing of Wizardry, Ultima, or even Dungeons & Dragons. In order for Dragon Quest to be successful, they would have to simplify the experience, a task which, at the time, many thought to be impossible. Development on Dragon Quest began in late 1985. Although Hori and Nakamura collaborated on the general gameplay and combat design, it was Hori who handcrafted almost every single aspect of the experience, from the design of the world map and the layout of towns and dungeons, to the monsters, weapons, items and spells to include, as well as the scenario that played out in the game. For the game's setting, Hori chose to go with a Western fantasy theme. While this might seem like an obvious choice with the benefit of hindsight, it wasn't a no-brainer back then. Hori felt that if the game were to draw on familiar elements like ninja, samurai, and Japanese folklore, it wouldn't have the sense of escapism he was going for. He wanted a game that would help expand people's imagination, and the sword and sorcery genre was something Japanese audiences at the time weren't so familiar with. For its exploration gameplay, Dragon Quest copied the style of Ultima, where the player would explore towns, dungeons, and the overworld from a top-down perspective. Combat, on the other hand, would play out like in Wizardry, with its random encounters and first-person battle scenes, where the enemy appeared in front of you as if seen through the player's own eyes. Still, Hori had a major problem to solve. Computer RPGs relied on complex control schemes that often used the entire keyboard. In Ultima, you interrogated NPCs using keywords you wrote out in plain text, while Wizardry demanded that you spell out the names of the magic you wanted to use in combat. This obviously wasn't an option with the Famicom, which relied entirely on a controller with only a D-pad and 2 primary buttons. But this was a problem Hori had already solved. In his murder mystery adventure titles, like the Portopia serial murder case and the Hokkaido serial murders, the player would originally interact with the game using a verb-noun parser that required the player to type precise commands using the keyboard. When Hori translated this experience over to the Famicom, he came upon the idea of introducing a menu with a set number of commands for the player to select using the D-pad. Hori decided to reuse the same system for his new role-playing game. While exploring, the menu would offer choices for how to interact with the world around you, with options such as talk, take, and open. In combat, the menu presented different options for how to approach the battle, letting the player fight, run, or use a spell or item. This design choice also had another huge benefit. Contemporary computer RPGs devoted a large part of the screen real estate to status windows, text parsers, and other elements. Hori's decision to move Dragon Quest's user interface into a contextual pop-up menu and display NPC dialogue in a similar window meant the game could free up the entire screen for its visuals, allowing the player to see a lot more of the world around them. But Hori and Nakamura still had some tough decisions to make. Around the time of Dragon Quest's development, the Famicom offered 2 types of software delivery systems: the basic cartridge, which Western gamers were familiar with, and the Japan-only Famicom disk system, which required the purchase of an add-on disk reader that allowed you to play games written to floppy disks. Making Dragon Quest an exclusive Famicom disk system title would have allowed for a much more complex game, due to the significantly larger amount of storage space available on a floppy disk compared to the cartridges used at the time. On the other hand, only a minority of Famicom owners would have had the disk system, and Hori was determined to reach the much larger market of the base Famicom system. But going for a cartridge release meant that all of the game's graphics, music, dialogue, item and monster data, as well as the general code, would have had to fit into a measly 64 kilobytes of memory. To put things into perspective, 64 KB is small even for a JPEG today, and a modern game like Final Fantasy XVI weighs in at 90 gigabytes on the PS5's hard drive, making it more than 1,000,000 times larger in size than the original Dragon Quest. If it meant getting their game into the hands of more players, Hori and Nakamura were willing to make some sacrifices. To begin with, the decision to go with the standard cartridge instead of floppy disks meant that the game would have no save game feature. Instead, the player would have to carefully copy down a lengthy password obtained from the king in order to keep their progress for their next session. To save space on the cartridge, most of the enemies encountered had to be reskins of previous monsters, taking advantage of the Famicom's ability to flip images horizontally as well as use different color palettes to give them a different look. Spells and items would also have to be kept to an absolute minimum, and even a lot of the game's dialogue had to be shaved off to make it fit. But the most significant sacrifices were made early on in the design process. When initially dreaming up his new role-playing game, Hori had wanted to include a party of multiple player characters, just like in Wizardry. But given the limitations of the Famicom cartridge, this idea had to be abandoned, and would only become a reality in the sequel. Another major concession was the scrapping of a planned job-changing system, which would eventually see the light of day in Dragon Quest III. While Hori and Nakamura weren't able to realize the full potential of their dream project, Dragon Quest's development would receive a massive boon in the form of the unexpected participation of a person who would come to define the visual style of the entire franchise and help propel the series to mainstream success. And it happened mostly through coincidence. One of the publications in which Enix had advertised its game design competition was Weekly Shonen Jump, an anthology of manga aimed primarily at young men. Pretty much every super popular series you can think of began its life in the pages of this magazine, including Bleach, One Piece, and Naruto, as well as one hugely influential manga in particular that's very relevant to this story. A young Yuji Hori had once aspired to become a mangaka, but he quickly realized that drawing comics wasn't for him. Instead, Hori showed a stronger affinity for writing. By the time he decided to enter his game Love Match Tennis into Enix's contest, he was already working as a writer for Shonen Jump, producing articles about Famicom games for the magazine's popular gaming pages. Hori's editor at Shonen Jump was a man named Katsuhiko Torishima, and aside from managing Hori, he also handled the work of a young mangaka by the name of Akira Toriyama, whose wildly popular new manga, Dragon Ball, was sweeping Japan at the time. Torishima was a huge fan of video games, so when Dragon Quest was starting development, the editor saw an opportunity to combine his two passions and maybe give the new game a bit of a boost. The way this story played out changes depending on who you ask, but the common thread is that Torishima got the ball rolling with a little white lie. The editor let Hori know that Toriyama was a big fan of his previous games, and that the mangaka was eager to get in on Hori's next title. None of this was true, but by the time Hori figured out that Torishima had made it all up, Toriyama had already signed up to design the game's characters. The collaboration with Toriyama turned out to be a match made in heaven. Toriyama's whimsical style was the perfect fit for a Famicom game, and his monster designs provided a fresh take on familiar concepts, like the ghost with its floppy hat and lolling tongue, the Draki, a cute ball-shaped bat with a big silly grin, and the golem with its brickwork body of comical proportions. But the most iconic monster designed by Toriyama is also the one that best illustrates his unique mindset. To provide the game with a weak, low-level enemy that could easily be dispatched in large quantities by novice heroes, Toriyama took Hori's rough conceptual sketch of a pile of goo and produced the Slime, a teardrop-shaped gelatinous critter with a smiley face that has come to represent the Dragon Quest franchise ever since. Another important addition to the game's development team had less to do with trickery, but just as much to do with coincidence. Video game music in the 80s was kind of a wasteland. Unlike today, when even mediocre games usually come with solid soundtracks, back then, few developers made sound a priority, and fewer still could afford the services of a truly gifted composer. The Dragon Quest team was fortunate enough to be the exception, but it happened in a very roundabout way. At the time, it was common for publishers like Enix to solicit feedback on their games through mail-in questionnaires, and one of the people who was more than happy to provide their takes in this way was a man named Koichi Sugiyama. Someone at Enix recognized this name as being that of a well-known composer for anime and television, and after contacting Sugiyama to confirm that he was in fact the Sugiyama, asked him if he would consider composing music for their games. Sugiyama accepted, leading to a partnership that would last for 35 years, ending only with Sugiyama's passing in 2021. Despite the primitive conditions he had to work with, Sugiyama brought his A game, realizing that the small number of tracks he could fit onto the game cartridge would have to stay tolerable for dozens and dozens of hours. Sugiyama went with a classical approach, believing that this style of music would hold up the longest without losing its appeal. The end result was one of the most celebrated video game soundtracks of its generation, and one of the most important scores in video game history. Compositions like the Overture March, which plays on the title screen, have become synonymous with video game music, and Sugiyama's soundtrack set the standard for what people would come to expect from a JRPG score. Countless games since have followed this same basic template of different tunes for different aspects of gameplay. An introductory overture to set the stage, a pastoral town theme, a grandiose castle theme, a stirring overworld theme, a foreboding dungeon theme, a catchy battle theme, a hectic final battle theme, and a triumphant ending theme. It might seem like an obvious setup today, but before Dragon Quest, these pre-established conventions didn't exist. It was Sugiyama who set them down. The combination of Hori's clever game design, Toriyama's charming characters, Sugiyama's epic music, and Nakamura's genius programming made for a sort of dream team of its time. But even though they all felt they had a great final product, they couldn't possibly imagine just how popular Dragon Quest would become. At least, eventually. Because believe it or not, Dragon Quest was not the instant success you might have imagined. And it took a bit of sneakiness to turn the tide. For many Japanese children, Dragon Quest would be their very first experience with an RPG, which was actually a bit of a problem. It might seem crazy to us now, but in 1986, the term RPG or role-playing game wasn't commonly used or even understood by most gamers. Even a cornerstone of the genre like Ultima 4 wouldn't have been called an RPG by most gaming publications at the time, as this type of software would have been more likely to be categorized as an adventure game. While Japanese computer gamers were cutting their teeth on foreign titles like Ultima and Wizardry, along with domestic offerings like Xanadu and the Black Onyx, most console gamers didn't know what to make of a game like Dragon Quest. In an era when console games were mostly linear campaigns with obvious milestones, an open-ended adventure like Dragon Quest with an entire world to explore and no clear path outlined for how to do it, presented a strange and confusing experience. To put it bluntly, many players didn't know what to do with their newfound freedom. They had to be taught what RPGs were all about. Fortunately, Yuji Horii had the perfect solution to this problem. Although Horii had leaned hard into his career in video games after the success of Love Match Tennis and his murder mystery trilogy, he had actually continued to freelance for Shonen Jump while working as a game designer, which put Horii in the perfect position to market his product to its target audience, Shonen Jump's millions of primarily young men and boys. Horii, writing under the pseudonym of Emperor Yu, happened to run a column in Shonen Jump where he introduced new Famicom games. When Dragon Quest initially failed to meet the team's lofty sales expectations, Horii decided to use his gaming column to sing the game's praises to his impressionable audience. But even more importantly, Horii could also use his position as an industry insider to teach prospective gamers how to play the game. In a series of articles published in Weekly Shonen Jump, Horii presented Dragon Quest to his readers, complete with a world map and colorful illustrations provided by Toriyama himself. Here, Horii could hype the game up while explaining how it was played. Horii's articles had a massive effect on the game's sales, and although Horii's use of his position within the magazine to promote his own game is probably one of the most flagrant conflicts of interest I've ever heard of, it's important to note that Shonen Jump also benefited from this marriage of interests. Not only did the magazine's exclusive scoop on one of the hottest titles of its time boost their readership by a significant number, but they also secured the rights to publish manga set in the Dragon Quest universe, which turned out to be a huge win when this deal eventually materialized as The Adventures of Dai, which went on to become one of Weekly Shonen Jump's best-selling manga of all time. With a little help from Horii's unorthodox marketing campaign, Dragon Quest eventually became a massive success, selling over 1 million copies in the first 6 months. But this was only the beginning. Successive games in the series would go on to smash sales records over and over, creating mass hysteria in Japan with the release of each new sequel. Yuji Horii became a national celebrity, and Dragon Quest quickly became synonymous with RPGs in Japan, inspiring many imitators as well as some legitimate contenders. In fact, Dragon Quest's impact on Japanese culture was so great that it even gave rise to a very persistent urban legend that's been going around since at least the early 90s. Because of how popular the games were, stores would sell out fast on release day. This led to long lines of people queuing up early to buy the game. And since the generally accepted practice in the industry at the time was for games to be released on weekdays, tons and tons of kids would skip school to secure their copy of the game. This became such a big problem, the story goes, that the Japanese government had to get involved, passing a law that Dragon Quest games specifically had to go on sale on a weekend or public holiday. But while this story is patently false and no such law ever existed, there is some truth to the story. Although the legislative branch never got involved, the government did have a hand in it. After Dragon Quest III came out, the police contacted Enix and told them in no uncertain terms that this was a big problem and they'd better do something about it. Enix, feeling bad for having created this nationwide problem, worked with Nintendo to have Dragon Quest games released on weekends, as a special exception to the industry standard. A practice that has remained true for every mainline title in the series since, with the exception of the online game Dragon Quest X. Given the great success Dragon Quest had enjoyed in its home country, it should come as no surprise that Enix was eager to try their luck with the Western market. But getting the game to sell in North America would turn out to be a lot harder. It would be a full 3 years before Dragon Quest arrived in North America, but when the decision to bring the game over was finally made, a lot of effort was put into its English localization, even in some areas you wouldn't normally touch. But this effort wasn't to be undertaken by Enix themselves. Since the company lacked a US branch capable of publishing games in North America, the task would instead be taken on by Nintendo of America themselves. And Nintendo of America had good reason to be very hopeful. Given the immense success they'd seen with The Legend of Zelda, the company reasoned that Dragon Quest could be their next great hit. But first, they had an important choice to make. By the time the project began, Dragon Quest III had already debuted in Japan, The sequel was a vastly more sophisticated title, regarded by many as the pinnacle of Dragon Quest's Famicom years. But instead of starting their audience off with the latest and greatest the series had to offer, Nintendo of America chose to go with the original game. This probably made sense at the time, given that American kids would have needed a soft introduction to the RPG genre, just like their Japanese counterparts had received 3 years earlier. To prepare Dragon Quest for its North American audience, the game text obviously had to be translated from Japanese into English. Although the project was done in partnership between Enix and Nintendo of America, the nitty-gritty details of the process were left to the publisher's discretion. And Nintendo of America made a lot of changes. Some of these were fairly innocent. Towns and monsters got new names that made better sense in English. The quirky Japanese spells were given self-explanatory titles like Heal, Hurt, and Stop Spell. And some of the NPCs were rebranded to fit the conventions of Western fantasy, which meant that the legendary hero Loto and Princess Laura became Erdrick and Gwaelin instead. In keeping with their own famously strict content rules, Nintendo of America also scrubbed the game of potential religious references and suggestive content. There's a lady in the town of Rimulder who tells you she's out of tomatoes, which seems kind of random. In the original Japanese, this woman, for a fee of 50 gold, offers to perform the service of Puff Puff, a Japanese onomatopoeic euphemism which means whatever you think it means. But some changes were more controversial, even at the time. A lot of the game's light-hearted tone and whimsical charm was lost in translation, as Yuji Hoри's clever puns and carefully crafted dialogue was replaced with a grandiose Elizabethan English mannerism, popularly known as Ye Olde English. The translation featured highlights like, "Thy gold increases by 11, and thou hast done well in defeating the slime." A decision which Hori and Enix had nothing to do with and later ended up regretting. But Nintendo of America went above and beyond simply localizing the game. They also went the extra mile when it came to upgrading the gameplay experience itself. The world map got a small touch-up with the introduction of proper coastlines to mark the boundary between land and sea. The sprites of player characters and NPCs got a visual upgrade to put them more in line with the ones from Dragon Quest II, adding a bit of detail and, more significantly, giving them 4-directional facing. The introduction of this feature also removed a minor inconvenience of the Japanese edition. There, when selecting the talk command, you had to choose the direction of the NPC with whom you wanted to speak. Now that the player character could turn in 4 directions, the game could just assume you wanted to talk to the guy you were facing. Even better, instead of the lengthy password, Japanese players had to scribe onto pieces of paper and pray they didn't get wrong. The North American version introduced 3 save slots, using the same button cell powered save system North American gamers had first gotten used to with The Legend of Zelda in 1987. However, not everything about the North American version was an upgrade. A couple of aspects of the game actually got worse. And one of these downgrades was the direct result of a decision taken to avoid a potential legal battle. One of the best things about starting up the Japanese original is the wonderful Dragon Quest logo that shows up on the title screen. But when it came time to publish the game in the United States, Nintendo of America realized they had a bit of a problem on their hands, because the trademark for Dragon Quest was held at the time by TSR, the original creators of Dungeons & Dragons, who had acquired their rights to a pen and paper role-playing game called Dragon Quest. To solve this issue, Nintendo of America decided to rebrand the game as Dragon Warrior, which admittedly sounded pretty darn cool to kids of the 1980s. This obviously meant that the title screen had to change too. But instead of attempting to recreate the fairy tale style of the original logo, the North American version went with a much simpler, some might even say lazy, design. And even though this obviously makes no difference once you're actually playing the game, I can't help but feel that the first impression is much weaker. Nintendo of America's changes didn't just extend to the contents of the game. Sweeping changes were also made to the game's packaging. instead of using Akira Toriyama's distinctive manga illustrations for the cover and manual, Nintendo of America commissioned new art to replace it in a far more generic sword and sorcery style. The decision to scrap the original artwork, which was so critical to the game's reception in its home country, might seem strange to young people of today who have grown up with anime and manga being a natural part of the cultural landscape. But back in the 80s and 90s, only the most die-hard Western fans even knew this stuff existed. Toriyama's cutesy, super deformed cartoon characters would have communicated to potential buyers that this was a product aimed at small children. And speaking as someone who was a kid back in the late 80s, I think they made the right call. Still, a generic cover and a crappy title screen isn't the end of the world. And whatever opinions one might have about the translation and minor acts of censorship, Dragon Warrior's battery-powered save feature and improved graphics undeniably made it the better version of the game. Unfortunately, that didn't seem to matter to the American public. Simply put, Dragon Warrior didn't perform to expectations in the US. Even though the game certainly found its share of ardent supporters, it failed to secure the kind of explosive impact Nintendo of America had hoped for. It's hard to say exactly why the game flopped. Various reasons have been given over the years, such as poor marketing, the choice to release the first Dragon Quest instead of the latest, more advanced entry, and a perceived American preference for action titles over turn-based games. As with any product that fails to sell, we can only ever guess the reasons why. And personally, I think it was mostly a matter of timing. Western console gamers just weren't ready for this kind of RPG experience. And unlike the perfect alchemy of advantageous factors that made Dragon Quest such a sizzling success in its home country, Dragon Warrior ended up being just another title that fizzled where it might have popped. But even though few people were willing to fork over money for Dragon Warrior, the game still found its way into the hands of hundreds of thousands of American gamers, free of charge. Realizing that they had stocked way too many copies of a game that wouldn't sell, and were facing a massive loss, Nintendo of America found a way to make the best of a bad situation. Rather than simply dumping the games in the desert and writing it off as the cost of doing business, they decided to offer the unsold copies of the game as a sign-up bonus for subscribers of their own Nintendo Power magazine, along with a 64-page strategy guide containing a full walkthrough of the game as well as tons of tips and tricks. The lure of a free Nintendo game proved to be a big draw, regardless of the title, so at the very least Nintendo of America were able to recoup some of their investment by increasing the readership of the magazine. And many young gamers who got a free taste of the RPG experience ended up hooked for life. The relative success of this promotion was short-lived, however. While Nintendo Power got the game into the hands of the masses, it didn't have the long-term impact they might have hoped for. And when Enix of America later started up operations and published the 3 NES sequels in the US on their own, sales numbers were less than mediocre. Even if not everyone appreciated the game at the time, Dragon Warrior or Dragon Quest, this was still a great console RPG. And a lot of it had to do with the game's design, because what Dragon Quest gave up in complexity compared to the more advanced computer titles, it more than made up for in accessibility. In some ways, Dragon Quest feels like a very old game today. Dungeons are nonsensical, featureless mazes that are pitch black without the help of a torch. You can't get item drops from defeating monsters, and aside from the golem that guards the town of Cantlin and the Dragon Lord himself, there really aren't any boss encounters in the sense that we know them today. But the most obvious marker for Dragon Quest's age is the game's interface. Now, I want to say for context that this was the first time I've ever played this game, for the simple reason that it was never released in my home country of Sweden back in the day. So even though I'm like really old, I approached this retrospective with fresh eyes. Where modern JRPGs often have to pace the introduction of its gameplay features, unlocking new options over a matter of dozens of hours, and often offering tutorials and lengthy explanations to keep from overwhelming the player, Dragon Quest's interface is incredibly simple. You move in 4 directions using the D-pad, exploring a world divided into square tiles. Most tiles can be walked across, but others like walls, rivers, and mountains present barriers to travel. The D-pad also navigates the game's menu, which pops up as an overlay when you chill for a moment or press the command button, and offers 8 different options for actions you can take. Talk lets you interact with the game's NPCs, open unlocks a nearby door but only if you have a magic key, a generic consumable item that opens a single door. Search examines the tile you're standing on for hidden treasure. Take will ransack a chest, and Stairs lets you go up or down a set of stairs if you're standing on the same tile. Item opens your inventory, so you can use something you're carrying, such as a herb that restores HP or a torch that lets you see in darkness. Magic brings up a list of spells you can use outside of combat, allowing you to heal yourself, but also to cast spells like Return, which brings you instantly back to the starting castle from anywhere on the overworld, and Repel, which keeps you from running into the most basic monsters. Finally, Status gives you the full rundown of your hero's attributes and whatever weapons and armor you're currently using. You might have noticed that there's something missing. In Dragon Quest, there's no equip command. Instead, whenever you buy a new weapon, armor, or shield, it will automatically replace whatever you're using, which really says a lot about just how old school this game is. Even for a traditional JRPG, Dragon Quest's control scheme feels ancient. Having to select a specific command from a menu just to go up a flight of stairs feels downright weird, and the lack of context-sensitive controls makes interacting with objects and NPCs feel very clunky. But however strange this design might seem today, compared to the alternatives at the time, it was literally child's play. Computer games of this era, like the legendary Ultima 4, could be super confusing, demanding careful study of thick manuals to figure out how to perform even the simplest operation, such as moving or casting a spell. And talking to NPCs meant spamming random keywords to try to get a reaction. By contrast, the NES's bare-bones controller, with only 2 face buttons to worry about and a D-pad for easy navigation, made the RPG experience so much more accessible. And while Ultima 4 offered orders of magnitude more potential for immersion, at least in Dragon Quest, you didn't have to memorize 2 different hotkeys for climbing up and down stairs. In many ways, the Famicom's limitations actually worked in the game's favor. With the console's simple controller input and limited hardware specs, Hori and Nakamura knew they wouldn't be able to offer the same depth and complexity as in the computer RPGs they were used to playing at home. Instead of trying to match those games, Dragon Quest distilled the basic concept of the RPG into an accessible, user-friendly, and very addictive formula. Such a streamlined design could have been seen as dumbing the game down, but when it was done this well, it turned into lightning in a bottle. And for all of its simplicity, Dragon Quest still had some major strengths. Because when it comes to one particular aspect of the RPG experience, Dragon Quest absolutely crushes it, even today. By far my biggest surprise playing Dragon Quest for the first time was just how open the game's exploration is, but you wouldn't necessarily know it at the first glance. When it comes to the fundamental mechanics of the exploration gameplay, there isn't all that much to say. You travel across a large overworld made up of separate but connected landmasses, visiting various towns, dungeons, and shrines. There are no special obstacles to overcome, and pathfinding is very simple. Instead, the main challenge is to endure the numerous random encounters you'll have to fight to get from one point to another. Every now and then, you'll need to make your way into a dungeon to retrieve some treasure. The insides of these dungeons are pitch black, and you can't even see a single step ahead of you without a torch, an item that can be bought in village shops. The game's first dungeon, Erdrick's Tomb, serves as a sort of tutorial to dungeon crawling, teaching you how to navigate the game's labyrinthine underground environments without having to worry about monsters. Dragon Quest's dungeons are extremely basic. There are no puzzles to solve, barely any treasure to loot, and aside from the final battle, the closest thing to a boss encounter is the green dragon that guards Princess Gwaelin. Instead, dungeon crawling is mostly a matter of finding your way through the maze, and even this process isn't all that hard. Where many traditional JRPGs of this era go hardcore into dungeon survival, Dragon Quest's dungeons are kind of chill, and you don't even spend all that much time in them. Aside from Erdrick's tomb and the Dragon Lord's lair in Charlock Castle, there's actually only 3 other dungeons in the whole game, and one of them is even optional. The vast majority of Dragon Quest's gameplay takes place on the world map, and it's got some interesting design. Like any traditional JRPG with a world map, Dragon Quest's landscape is made up of different types of terrain. Aside from mountains and water, which create barriers between different regions, there's also plains, forests, hills, deserts, and marshlands for you to traverse. Normally, the difference between these terrain types would be mostly cosmetic, or maybe you'd end up fighting different monsters depending on the environment. But in Dragon Quest, terrain matters a lot more. Traveling through plains gives you the lowest possible encounter rate, while forests, marshes, and deserts will have you run into monsters more often, and the most dangerous terrain being hills. Marshlands also sap your hit points with every step, unless you're in possession of the game's ultimate suit of armor. This setup actually gives you an incentive to pick your path with a bit more forethought, since sometimes the most direct path is not necessarily the best one. Although each gained level and piece of equipment opens up new horizons for you, there are certain milestones that have a more drastic effect on how you can approach the game. At level 3, you get your first healing spell, allowing for longer trips away from the castle. At level 9, you learn Radiant, which removes the need for carrying a torch. And at level 10, you're given Stop Spell, which lets you dominate enemy spellcasters, some of the game's most volatile encounters. But the most significant of these milestones comes when you hit level 13, because this is when you finally get your hands on Return. From this point on, you're never too far from home to get back safely. And when you combine it with the Outside spell at level 12, which pulls you instantly out of dungeons when you need to escape, this allows you to play considerably more aggressively in your exploration efforts. Dragon Quest is a truly non-linear open-world experience. Aside from the Dragon Lord's castle, every single area of the map is available to you right from the start, as long as you're strong enough to survive the journey. Different parts of the world are home to different monsters, and generally speaking, the further you go from Tentacle Castle, the more dangerous the monsters get. Most of these boundaries are helpfully marked by bridges, which indicate that the challenge will get stiffer on the other side. But there's nothing stopping you from crossing that bridge before you're ready. There is definitely an optimal route to take to beat the game, but Dragon Quest never gets too heavy-handed about it. You might have a slightly tougher time depending on which direction you choose to go first, but that's all part of the game's charm. It's the same kind of feeling I get from playing Skyrim, and that level of freedom was pretty darn impressive back in 1986. And even by today's standards, Dragon Quest is still a remarkably open-ended experience, because there's not a lot of stuff you have to do to beat the game. The goal of Dragon Quest is given to the player by the king at the start of the game. Defeat the evil Dragon Lord, and if possible, rescue Princess Gwaelin from the clutches of evil. But the way you approach this task is pretty much up to you. Aside from the fact that you'd never survive the trip, there's only one thing stopping you from going straight to Charlock Castle and challenging the Dragon Lord right from the start. The path to the island upon which the villain's castle sits is cut off from the southeastern continent by a narrow strip of water. To create a bridge across the strait, you'll need the Rainbow Drop, a relic you assemble by bringing 3 key items to the sage in the shrine south of the town of Remoldar: the Staff of Rain, the Stones of Sunlight, and Erdrick's Token. Erdrick's Token is obtained by searching a specific spot on the map, and you could theoretically grab it whenever you want, assuming you know what you're looking for. To get the Staff of Rain, you'll need to exchange the Silver Harp, which is found at the bottom of Garin's grave in Garinholm. Finally, the Stones of Sunlight are hidden beneath Tentacle Castle. You'll also need some magic keys for Garin's grave and Tentacle Castle, so you'll have to make a trip to the town of Remoldar and its special shop. And that's it. There's no other mandatory actions you need to take to beat the game. Although realistically, to actually have a shot at defeating the Dragon Lord, you'd also want Erdrick's armor from the ruins of Hawksness, the silver shield from the town of Cantlin, and Erdrick's sword from Charlock Castle. but you can probably power level past these requirements if you have enough patience. Even some objectives that seem mandatory are actually optional. The fairy flute can be used to put the golem that guards the town of Cantlin to sleep, making the fight much easier. But you don't actually need the flute to win the fight, you just have to be a lot stronger without it. You'll also notice that in this list of necessary actions, I seem to have left out a pretty important task. What about the kidnapped princess? Well, that's because rescuing Gwaelin from the marsh cave is entirely your choice. While liberating the princess from the green dragon that guards her gives you a pretty nifty reward, you can safely leave Gwaelin in the dragon's care if you so prefer. If you beat Dragon Quest without saving Princess Gwaelin, the game's ending will actually reflect that. And there's even a slight variation if you defeat the Dragon Lord while carrying the princess. Basically, if it wasn't for the fact that you're far too weak at the start of the game, you could beat Dragon Quest in less than an hour. Assuming, that is, that you already know where to go and what to do. A criticism I've sometimes seen people raise against the game is that some of its secrets, such as the location of the fairy flute in Kol, the entrance to Garen's grave, and the existence of Erdrick's armor, are pretty obscure and almost impossible to find without a guide. But I didn't find this to be true. Even playing the game blind without the aid of a walkthrough, I had no trouble locating every key item in the game just by following in-game instructions. And when I say instructions, I mean talking to NPCs. Because unlike a modern JRPG, where the main role of NPCs is often to provide immersion, world building, and side quests, Dragon Quest's non-player characters are there to provide you with the information you need to beat the game. Almost every NPC in the game has something useful to say. The exact location of Erdrick's token is given to you by an old man in the town of Cantlin. You'll know where to pick up the fairy flute if you find its owner, Howard, behind a locked door in Rimuldar. A soldier in Tantacle Castle tells you how to find the entrance to Garen's grave, though you'll have to put 2 and 2 together to figure it out. And if you want to grab Erdrick's armor, you'll need to talk to 3 different people in Cantlin and piece their clues together to mark the spot. And even if some of these clues would have gone over your head as a kid, you have to look at the game within the context of its time. Most kids who played Dragon Quest would have had access to a dozen or more schoolyard friends who were also eagerly exploring Alefgard at the same time. Trading tips and tricks and bragging about who had the most gold or the highest level would have been the natural state of how to play this game when it was brand new. Dragon Quest throws you out into the world with a clear goal, but only loose instructions on how to achieve it. And the genius thing is that there's really no wrong way to go about it. Simply by exploring the world, talking to everyone you meet, and powering up your character, you'll eventually figure it all out. And you'll have felt like you were on an adventure of your own making the whole time. Especially if you lean hard into what Dragon Quest is all about, the spirit of exploration. Dragon Quest has no in-game world map. Sure, the manual shows a rough outline of the world with some key features for you to reference, but there's no way to pull up an actual map of Alefgard while playing the game. The same goes for the various dungeons. This is to be expected out of a game from this era, but it can feel extra harsh when you have to explore a maze with the aid of a torch that only illuminates a single step in every direction. And sure, you could mitigate all of this by using a walkthrough, but to my mind, the right way to play this game is without a guide, completely blind. While the absence of in-game maps might seem like a missing feature from a modern perspective, I would argue that it's a crucial part of the experience. Early on in my playthrough, I decided that if I'm going to really get into the spirit of what playing this game would have been like back in 1986, I'd want to draw my own maps. Rather than busting out my old graph paper notebooks though, I compromised, going with a Google Sheets document over a pen and paper approach. Making my own map felt like putting the pieces of a giant jigsaw puzzle together piece by piece. Bit by bit, I'd stop to fill in my surroundings, tile by tile, until I'd eventually charted the entire world, and most of its dungeons. Drawing my own maps really helped make the experience a lot more fun and immersive. Now, instead of ticking off tasks on a list in some guide, I was seeing the world at my own pace, taking pleasure in the simple act of exploration. This got me a lot more excited about playing the game, and even made Dragon Quest's super basic dungeon crawling a lot more enjoyable. Mapping out Garen's grave and figuring out how all the different staircases connected to each other was one of the highlights of my whole experience. And Dragon Quest's world is full of design choices that reward this behavior. As you explore, you're constantly glimpsing distant lands at the very edge of your vision, places you still can't quite reach, but will later. Shops are full of items with price tags that seem hopelessly out of reach when you first see them, but they will eventually be yours. And even the starting castle has locked rooms with treasure chests for you to salivate over, even if the ultimate rewards are not that exciting. But the best example of this design philosophy is in how the game communicates its final goal. Rather than place the Dragon Lord's castle in some far-flung corner of the map, Yuji Horii set it down in sight of Tentacle Castle, so you'd see it across the water the moment you began your journey. Horii wanted the player to know where they were going, even if they had no idea how to get there. And this kind of feeling runs all the way through the Dragon Quest experience. The presence of undiscovered territory pulls you forward, and the game's use of soft gating instead of hard barriers means you're spoiled for choices. While it was never obvious to me what my next step should be, I always felt I had plenty of options. Because of the game's open-ended design, each play session felt less about continuing the story or carrying out some appointed task, and more about setting your own goals. Today I'm going to try to reach that city across the river. This time I'm gonna see what that dungeon is all about. Or today I'm gonna save up for a new suit of armor. It's not about what the game wants you to do, but what you want to do with the game. Dragon Quest is, in most regards, an antiquated experience. But the game has something that modern JRPGs like Final Fantasy XVI, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, or even Dragon Quest XI don't. The feeling of being let loose in an uncharted world, with endless possibilities stretching far and wide in every direction, and finding your own way. There's a simple joy in the sense of adventure the game gives you. The epic quest, the promise of a princess to save from an evil dragon, and the wicked castle that looms on the horizon across the water. A world to explore in every direction, one that starts out feeling huge and daunting, but which you will eventually conquer, step by step. And in this sense, the fundamental core of the exploration gameplay still holds up very well even today. That said, there are definitely aspects that have aged very poorly. And some of these issues must have been frustrating even at the time. Game design in the 1980s was not so much a science as it was a process of throwing crazy ideas at the wall and seeing what stuck. And Dragon Quest is a good example of that principle, because not all of its ideas were equally good. Having to use a torch to navigate dungeons is an interesting concept, but it gets kind of old before long. And by the time you get the Radiant spell, it no longer matters anyway. More annoying is how the game handles locked doors. In Dragon Quest, keys are generic one-time items that open any door, and the only way to get them is to buy them ahead of time in a special shop. Which means that you'll occasionally find yourself in a town or dungeon where the path forward is blocked by a locked door, and your only choice is to leave the place and go purchase a key in a town halfway across the world. Even worse, doors actually respawn when you leave a location, so if you're forced to depart the dungeon midway through, you'll have to bring a new set of keys the next time. But this respawning rule doesn't just apply to doors. It's also true of the game's chests. And while it would seem that the possibility of claiming the same piece of treasure over and over would be massively exploitable, it isn't quite the boon you might think. Outside of a handful of special items, there really isn't a lot of good loot in this game. Most chests just hold a tiny bit of gold or some item you could easily buy from the local shop, so it doesn't feel very rewarding to seek out treasure. I also found myself wishing for more secrets to find. There's a lot of interesting little dead ends on the world map that look like natural points to hide treasure, but there's never anything cool to find. A great example is the desert maze in the middle of the map. This place looks so enticing from a distance, you can't help but feel there's gotta be something epic hidden at the center. But when you finally make it all the way there, you realize it's actually pointless. I often fought hard to reach these special looking spots, but always came away feeling disappointed when there was nothing there to reward my curiosity. Especially since the search command is only used like 4 times in the whole game. Another source of frustration with exploring Dragon Quest's world is in how the game handles one of its most central features: random encounters. While many later JRPGs designed their encounter algorithms to maintain a somewhat even distribution of battles in order to prevent frustrations or outright unfair situations, Dragon Quest is much more old school. It's fully possible to fight 3 consecutive battles in 3 steps if you're exceptionally unlucky. But it's equally possible to walk halfway across the world without meeting a single monster, as speedrunners have demonstrated using clever routing and meticulous RNG manipulation. But the biggest issue with the game's design is something even more fundamental. Although you can rest at inns to recover hit points and MP at various towns all over the world, the only place to actually save your game is with a king in Tentacle Castle. Having to make the long journey back to the very start every time you want to record your progress gets really old really fast, especially since you'll have to fight so many battles along the way. The repel spell helps cut down on the most trivial encounters, and the return spell at least saves you the trip to the castle, but you'll still have to walk all the way back to where you were to continue your quest. This wouldn't be such an issue if not for the fact that Dragon Quest is missing a key feature I'd expect from a game like this. In my retrospective review of the original Final Fantasy, I talked about how the game uses Metroidvania world design to enrich its exploration, by allowing you to acquire different vehicles that unlock not just new parts of the world, but also significant shortcuts between areas you've already seen. Dragon Quest is a more open world experience than Final Fantasy, but the lack of any kind of ability to open up shortcuts by acquiring new items or powers is something I keenly felt as I played the game. A high-level levitation spell that allows you to cross rivers would have been a really cool feature, but an even better approach would have been to make the game's key items actually useful. The Staff of Rain, the Stones of Sunlight, and Erdrick's Token represent major milestones in the game's titular quest. But aside from being used to create the Rainbow Drop, these items fill no function at all. The Staff of Rain could have had the power to create paths across rivers, and maybe the Stones of Sunlight would allow for a passage through an icy mountain pass. Even Erdrick's Token could have found a use in convincing a special NPC to ferry you between 2 spots on different continents. Still, most of these perceived flaws can be easily explained by the simple fact that the developers were working with an extremely limited amount of memory. They wouldn't have been able to fit more features into the game even if they'd wanted to. And for the most part, Dragon Quest is still an enjoyable experience today, as long as you don't mind doing a bit of grinding. With Dragon Quest, Yuji Horii stripped the role-playing experience down to its bare minimum. You only control a single hero and never fight more than 1 monster at a time. There are no classes to choose from, no stats or abilities to assign, no skills to pick or spells to find. And outside of the order in which you buy the different weapons and armor, even the game's gear progression lacks meaningful choices. The role-playing genre can be hard to pin down, and people often argue about what counts and doesn't count as an RPG. But there is one fundamental aspect that most people would agree is required, and it can be used to explain the basic appeal of the entire genre: character progression. Humans have a deep-rooted desire to grow stronger, make permanent progress, and overcome obstacles. RPGs cater to these needs by providing concrete goals, clear feedback, and satisfying rewards. You're obviously stronger now, not just because your stats went up, but because you came back and smashed that dragon that kicked your butt a couple of hours ago. Modern JRPGs weave this character progression into other elements of the experience. Nowadays, leveling up is something that happens as a natural consequence of playing the game. And while you can still grind if you really want to, you're no longer forced to do it. But Dragon Quest doesn't have any alternate modes of progression, and its critical path is so short it wouldn't take you more than an hour to beat if you started at max level and knew where to go. Instead, the game is really all about growing stronger through intentionally grinding random encounters, and that can be a pretty tedious process. To begin with, combat itself is extremely basic. Hero and monster take turns attacking, and there aren't a lot of interesting tactics involved. The only meaningful choices you'll make are when to fight and when to flee, and when to spend your precious MP. Sleep can be very effective against certain enemies. Stop spell shuts down enemy spellcasters, and some early enemies cannot be safely fought until you get the hurt spell. But 9 times out of 10, you're only ever going to attack, heal, or run. Dragon Quest's turn-based combat isn't so much about strategy as it is about risk management. And the final battle is the perfect example of this design. A modern JRPG would slowly build your mastery of its mechanics, starting from the very basics and adding on piece by piece over the course of the game, until the final battle becomes a sort of final exam on everything you've learned. Dragon Quest, in all its old-school simplicity, remains just as straightforward from start to finish. Against the Dragon Lord, there are no clever tactics to try, no equipment to shuffle around, and no special abilities that would make a difference. You are either strong enough to beat the final boss, or you're not. And if you didn't conserve enough MP while fighting your way through Charlock Castle, you're going to lose either way. The only thing that truly matters in Dragon Quest is your character's level, and keeping up with the game's enemies can be quite a chore. Character progression feels extremely slow, even by the standards of traditional JRPGs, and it just gets worse the further you get. For every half hour of fun exploring a dungeon or seeing a new part of the world, I'd spend 1 to 2 hours of pure grinding to level up. By the time I reached Charlock Castle, I was more than ready for the game to be over. And even then, I'd rushed to get there. At a relatively low level of 19, it took a lot of luck to finish the job. A big part of the problem is that the original version of the game is extremely stingy with levels. Later remakes, including the Super Famicom version, greatly reduced the amount of time you need to spend fighting monsters. Although the effect is not so noticeable at the very first levels, it quickly becomes a major factor. Many enemies in the mid and late game give 3 times as much experience in the Super Famicom version compared to the original. You're playing the same game, but you're not getting the same experience. No pun intended. The rewards also don't scale very well with difficulty, meaning you're not really encouraged to go after monsters that present an actual challenge. Dragon Quest doesn't use any kind of XP scaling based on your level, so you'll power up a lot faster and easier by beating up monsters that are a little too weak for you. But in spite of how slow the process is and how tedious fighting can get, Dragon Quest still has a fundamentally satisfying sense of progression. It's hard to beat the feeling you get the first time you one-shot a monster that used to slap you around. Every time you get strong enough to visit a new part of the world, it feels like a big deal. And even though it doesn't happen very often, leveling up is a major occasion. You're expected to finish the game around level 20, and the max is 30, so a single level can make a huge difference. At the end of the day, grinding is addictive. It doesn't matter how mind-numbing the process is, getting stronger is inherently motivating. It's tough having to leave the house knowing that you're only 250 XP away from level 22. And as tedious and frustrating as Dragon Quest's grinding can be, the emphasis on this element was actually one of the pillars of the game's design philosophy. And with good reason. Dragon Quest can seem pretty basic from a modern perspective. And for the grandfather of a genre famous for its 100-hour playthroughs, it's not a very long game. It shouldn't take you more than 15 to 20 hours to defeat the Dragon Lord, even if you're completely new to the genre. But this is actually a feature rather than a bug. Dragon Quest was designed to be a more accessible version of the computer RPGs of its era. It had a simple interface that didn't need a thick manual to explain how to use it. It did away with complicated mechanics like inventory management, encumbrance, and depleting food rations that had to be replenished to keep your heroes from starving. It offered streamlined character progression without the need for tough decisions or careful optimization of attributes and skills. It presented a straightforward goal and went out of its way to make sure the player would have all the information they need without having to painstakingly interrogate NPCs using hidden keywords. And while leveling up in older Dungeons & Dragons inspired computer games could take quite a while even at the start, Yuji Horii tweaked his experience tables so that players would rise in power quickly in the early stages, giving you a chance to get hooked on the game before things slow down. It might seem obvious, but how hard a given player will find Dragon Quest depends entirely on how much time they're willing to invest. The Dragon Lord can be beaten as early as level 17 with a lot of luck and a strong heart, but you'll likely enjoy the process a lot more if you wait until at least level 22. And players who go all the way up to level 30 will find the final battle a total joke. In fact, reaching max level is so overkill, even the king berates you at this point, telling you to stop screwing around and go do your job. The power of this design model is not to be underestimated. It is perhaps the single most important factor in explaining the enduring popularity of the traditional JRPG. The turn-based combat system means it's not a matter of quick reflexes or fine motor skills. The more you play, the stronger you become, and the stronger you become, the easier the game gets. So if you're having a hard time, you don't need to get good. You just need to make your character stronger. In keeping with this design philosophy, Dragon Quest was also a lot more forgiving than the games that inspired it. A lot of the appeal of wizardry came from how tense each dungeon expedition could get, knowing that a single stroke of bad luck could wipe out all of the progress you'd made. While Dragon Quest retains this general feeling of tension and release as you venture out into the world to earn experience points and gold, the stakes are much lower. Dying in Dragon Quest means getting sent back to the king with all of your XP and items intact, the only penalty being that you'll have to part with half of your gold. A setback for sure, depending on where you are in the game, but hardly the end of the world. It's actually a lot more lenient than even later JRPGs, including the original Final Fantasy. And speaking as someone who once lost 6 hours of progress to a single unlucky encounter in Final Fantasy VII's Northern Cave, I can kinda see the appeal. This lenient approach meant that in Dragon Quest, progress was assured. It didn't matter how unlucky you got, or even how bad you were at the game. As long as you kept playing, you would eventually grow strong enough to take down the Dragon Lord. While the most advanced RPGs of the time could be punishingly hard and were often designed so that only the most dedicated and tenacious players could even hope to beat them, Dragon Quest was built for accessibility and fairness. Yuji Horii has said many times that his intent with Dragon Quest was to create a warm, inviting world, a world full of heart, with cute monsters that were fun to look at, a lighthearted story of good versus evil, a game without a game over screen, where enemies are defeated instead of killed. A game that would speak not to the computer that ran the software, but to the person holding the controller in front of the screen. Which was why Horii's Dragon Quest would not be a story about a legendary hero, but rather a story where you are the hero. Altercade's coming was foretold by legend. May the light shine upon this brave warrior. Dragon Quest's story is pretty basic even for an old school RPG. You are the descendant of the legendary hero Erdrick, who once saved the land from demons by wielding the mystical power of the Ball of Light. Many years later, the evil Dragon Lord has stolen the Ball of Light and blanketed the land with an army of monsters. You must defeat the Dragon Lord, recover the Ball of Light, and restore peace to the kingdom of Alefgard. Along the way, you'll prove yourself worthy as Erdrick's successor, retrieve his legendary weapons and armor, and rescue a kidnapped princess. And that's basically the whole story. There are no significant developments, no setbacks, and no plot twists to speak of, except for the fact that the princess is not being held by the Dragon Lord, and can be rescued at any point in the story, or not at all. Which, to be fair, was a pretty fresh idea at the time. And yet, when the game was released in 1986, Dragon Quest was considered to be one of the best stories ever told in a video game, and a revolution in storytelling for console titles. And the main reason for that had to do with the game's protagonist, you. Dragon Quest offered a rare opportunity for a console game of its time, the chance to not just take control of the hero, but to become the hero. And the game was built from the ground up with this principle in mind, where many Famicom adventures of the same era told their stories through text crawls on the title screen or between stages, or even left the storytelling entirely to the manual. Dragon Quest had you input your name and then got the King of Alefgard to fill you in on the details face to face. The illusion was enhanced by the first-person perspective of combat, where the entire screen would shake when you took a hit. And it's also the reason for a long-running tradition in the Dragon Quest series: silent protagonists. Even though you spend a lot of the game talking to NPCs, the hero himself never speaks. Hori wanted a silent protagonist because he felt that by giving the hero lines of dialogue, he would be putting words in the player's mouth. Dragon Quest's unconstrained world design and open-ended structure gave you the freedom to play as you desired. You guided the hero on his path, making all of the choices along the way. But it wasn't an expression of perfect freedom. Some level of illusionism was necessary to keep players on track. While the world lies open to you from the start, you cannot reach the Dragon Lord's castle without first assembling the Rainbow Drop. And even in those few instances, when you're actually given an outright choice of yes or no, it's really just a sleight of hand. There are 4 times in Dragon Quest where you're asked a question, but it never matters what you say. The Dragon Lord asks you to join him before the final battle, but taking him up on his offer is quite literally a death sentence. And saying no to any of Princess Gwaylin's questions results in the now legendary meme, "But thou must." So you can't tell her you won't carry her back to the castle, you can't say you don't love her, and you certainly can't leave the kingdom without her. Talk about a toxic relationship. But even this sort of design was a calculated move by Yuji Horii. While Wizardry used only a bare-bones story as a framing device for why the heroes would descend into its dungeon, and Ultima provided a remarkably open-ended experience that could be confusing or even overwhelming to many players, Horii felt that a compelling and clearly communicated story would act as a sort of guardrail for players to hold on to while playing the game. In this way, Horii was able to influence the player's path through subtle cues, creating a story that felt infinitely free, even though it was clearly bounded by strict rules. A story where the player would feel in control of their own destiny, without running the risk of getting overwhelmed by too much freedom. And in the case of But Thou Must, I believe this too was a clever gamble. After all, when given the choice to rescue a beautiful princess and win her love, how many players were actually going to turn her down? And so by offering the choice, even though it was a false one, Dragon Quest gave the player a sense of self-determination. Still, the fact that you could choose not to rescue Gwaylin at all was really impressive for a game of its time. Sure, the damsel in distress who falls hopelessly in love with the hero at first sight is a sexist trope, and it would have been a billion times cooler if the princess had taken up a sword to join you in battle. But having someone tell you they love you every time you return to save your game is kinda more satisfying than I'd like to admit. Dragon Quest might be a simple tale, but it's one of the most enduring ever told. It's a coming-of-age story about a courageous young boy who travels the world, fights monsters, finds a magic sword, rescues a princess, defeats an evil dragon, saves the kingdom from darkness, and wins the love of a beautiful maiden. It may be formulaic, but it's worked pretty darn well for the last 5,000 or so years. And for all of its simplicity, it's still good. Before I go on, I just want to say if you enjoyed this video, I'd be super grateful if you could hit the like button and leave a quick comment, as it really helps the video reach more people. I read every comment I get, no matter how old the video is, and if you want to support me, consider subscribing to my channel so I know people want to see more videos like this. To be perfectly honest, when I first started up Dragon Quest with the intention of making this video, I wasn't actually expecting to like it. And for sure there were times during my playthrough when I wasn't having fun, because Dragon Quest feels rough to play today. There's no complexity to the story, no characters to get to know, and the gameplay loop is slow, grindy, and monotonous. There's only a single place to save your game, so you have to constantly backtrack across the world. Making sure you have enough magic keys to re-challenge a dungeon is kind of a drag. Leveling up feels super slow because there just isn't enough content to go around it. And there's not much to look forward to either. No cool new powers or companions, no plot twists or hype scenes. Once you've been playing for about an hour, you've already seen pretty much everything the game has to offer. Today, Dragon Quest looks more like a proof of concept of a JRPG than an actual game, and there's nothing here that hasn't been done better in a later title. But that's not to say the game can't be enjoyed. Far from it. Because as dated as Dragon Quest feels today, the fundamental appeal of the RPG genre is still very much there. Real life is full of challenges and setbacks. It's often hard to know what you should be doing or if you're even making progress towards your goals. And there's no guarantee that diligence, patience, and hard work will ever be rewarded. RPGs are different. These games offer up an experience where you can clearly see your progress, where every challenge you tackle makes you stronger, richer, and more capable, and where every step along the way takes you just a bit closer to ultimate triumph. And when you're considering a brief escape from the troubles of everyday life, there's something incredibly appealing about that framework. For all my frustrations, I genuinely enjoyed my time in the Kingdom of Alefgard. Exploring new areas, drawing my own map, and finding new things was legitimately fun. If the game had offered a bit of party management, if the character progression had been better integrated into exploration and dungeon crawling, and if there were more secrets and treasure to find along the way, then this could have been a really great experience even today. Dragon Quest's gameplay has aged well for an RPG from 1986, and I think that's kind of what set this game apart at the time. It wasn't just something clever and new, it was a very well-designed game that was easy to grasp and hard to put down. Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura wanted to share their love of role-playing games with the world, and even though the game they produced was the simplest possible version of that experience, that just meant the format had room to grow. Dragon Quest proved that role-playing games could work on consoles. It proved that they could have mainstream appeal and sell millions of copies, and it paved the way for countless others to follow in their footsteps. Without the success of Dragon Quest, Hironobu Sakaguchi probably wouldn't have gotten the go-ahead from management to make his passion project, a little game called Final Fantasy, and that's just one of many examples of JRPG series that owe their existence to the trailblazing efforts of Dragon Quest, the mother of all JRPGs. Anyway, I'm just some guy on YouTube and these are just my personal opinions. Whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear about your experiences with Dragon Quest in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day!